Okay, so with Kind of host, she's
Okay, hold on. We're live.
okay.
Just give me one sec. Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to this morning's live stream. My name is Jody Williams, and I am the co-chair for the First Nations Métis Inuit Education Association of Ontario. We are really excited to bring this session to you today to continue the important conversation in regards to this week, which is known as Treaties Recognition Week. And so just to give you a little bit of background on who we are as an organization. So we are a subject association, and we work to provide quality resources and supports across the province to ensure good Indigenous education is happening in classrooms. Our work is guided by an Elders Advisory Council, and these elders, many of them are residential school survivors, fluent language speakers, and they really guide and shape the work that we do to make sure that the information is accurate and quality information coming to you. So today I'm very excited to introduce to you a speaker that we've had on our series before, and we're delighted to have him again spend the time with us this morning. So Isaac Murdoch, I just want to welcome you to today's session, and I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Okie doke. Well, hello everybody. My name's Isaac Murdoch. I'm from Serpent River First Nation, and I'm from the Fish Clan. And so I'm going to start off with a traditional greeting in my language. And this is something that we always do in our Native communities. Is we always introduce ourselves in our language. We give our name, we give where we're from, and also our clan. And so many Indigenous peoples have a clan system or a family system that's governed by the animals. And so I'll give this traditional greeting. Ani buju, mantanap kinege go na be, bom gijik Indigenous cause. Ginabe guk shabigaj wat, ganabajing and donjaba, gnoje gigon do them. And so that's my greeting. I come from a place where the serpents are painted on the rocks. And my name means the man who paints the rocks. And I'm from the Jackfish clan, which is a part of the larger fish clan in the Great Lakes. And so that's who I am. So Jody, are we just going to take it away from here?
Sure thing. Do you want me to put the slides up?
Sure. So first off, I just want to welcome all of you for coming and for tuning in and for being a part of this class. What we're going to do is we're going to look at a historical timeline of when the British first arrived here all the way till now, and what has happened and how the land was essentially stolen from Indigenous people, how the Indigenous people were oppressed, and how it affected the environment. But we're also going to look at solutions. How do we fix this problem that we're in? And so it's going to be a bit of a history class, so you got to bear with me on this. But it is interesting. So I want you to really focus into what we're saying, and I want you to start connecting the dots, because what happened here to Indigenous people has happened to everybody all over the world, basically. So this very strategic and well thought out plan on how to steal lands has been happening all over the world for a very long time. And so these systems of land dispossession have been formulated and in the works for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so this is the blueprint on how to steal land and get resources to market. And so we're going to start off with something called the Doctrine of Discovery. And so in this slide here, we have the Papa Bull issued on 18th of June, 1452 by Pope Nicholas V. It authorized Portugal to conquer pagans and consign them to perpetual servitude. In other words, to make them slaves. We grant you by these present documents with our apostolical authority full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, subjugate the pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, whoever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. And so basically, it was through this doctrine of discovery that it gave the notion that European countries could come to other countries, such as the Americas, and they could, of course, if they weren't Christians, if they weren't following Jesus Christ, then it gave those settlers the authority to take their lands and have them as servants. And so this is very important because this is the notion of their mindset. So when they first came here, they truly believed that they had some sort of godly authority to of course exercise a severe, wicked, brutal genocide against Indigenous people. And of course, there's all sorts of documentation, all sorts of history, oral history of what exactly happened when the settlers first came here. It was brutal. Like it was so mean, it was so horrible that I can't even tell you, because it's just those things should never ever be said. But I can tell you that the doctrine of discovery, it gave the Europeans the power. They felt the power from the Lord to be able to do this work in the name of Jesus Christ. And so they came here with this notion that they could conquer lands based on the doctrine of discovery. Next slide. Well, a lot has happened between the doctrine of discovery and treaties. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the treaties were led up to. So after the doctrine of discovery, of course, you had Spain, you had Portugal, you had France, you had England. They're all like, they arrive on the shores of North and South America. They're all wondering, how are they going to be able to get it all? And back in those days, I mean, everybody wanted to conquer the whole entire world. That's basically what was happening. And so the British, they believed that the sun would never set on the British Empire, simply because the world is round. And if they owned the whole world, then the sun could never set on the British Empire. And so their quest for world domination wasn't even a secret. Like they even advertised it saying, we want the whole world. And so, of course, they defeated the French on the Plains of Abraham. And that was in 57, I believe, 1757. And they defeated the French and said, okay, this land here is now the British's land. And they really believed that. And it was through the doctrine of discovery that they had that war and trying to find out who was going to own the lands. And so the Spanish, of course, ended up getting pushed further to the south. The Spanish were up at the Great Lakes too. My tribe killed them and pushed them back And so they kept getting pushed back by the Indigenous people and then by the Americans eventually. And they ended up with, of course, Mexico, a lot of countries south of that. And so north, you had basically at that time the French and the British. And in the United States, those colonies, they started to disintegrate as loyalist colonies, which means that they're loyal to the crown, and they wanted to form their own country, and they did, which was the United States. And of course, you had Britain, who had the northern part, um, and they were, of course, trying to get the United States land, or what they felt was United States land, and it started to cause problems. And so the French were kind of out of it by by the 1800s. They weren't a military power in North America anymore. It was mainly the Americans and the British, and even the British weren't even a military power. And so there was a big struggle for land. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the Europeans were all fighting over these lands to see who can control them. But there's one thing that needs to be said. These were indigenous lands with indigenous peoples. And so when you read the history books, you're just reading how these European countries uh, sent explorers over here under the Doctrine of Discovery. They were able to conquer how they said it was they conquered these lands and that they were able to secure them. And of course, once they did, their descendants formed these colonies and they formed their own countries after a while, which is now known as Canada and the United States and Mexico and so on and so forth. And so basically, it was during the War of 1812 where the British and the Americans were able to define the boundaries of what is Canada and the United States. And that's basically what happened. But again, Indigenous people were not involved in that. So I don't believe that it's a legitimate boundary. And I don't believe that Canada, because it was formed on Indigenous lands, without Indigenous consent or without Indigenous stewardship, how can Canada even claim to be a country when it stole Indigenous lands, put a genocide on them, and uh, and basically decimated the Indigenous peoples, and then call themselves a country? It doesn't seem legitimate. It's almost like me stealing somebody's truck, you know, and then beating up the people's truck that I stole, and then calling it my truck. Well, no, that's not my truck. If I do that, that's stealing. That's somebody else's truck. And so the same thing happened with the lands. The Indigenous people were systematically forced through a genocide, and they were damaged deeply by the British, by the Americans, and by Canada. And the lands were stolen. And the treaties doesn't mean that the lands were given to Canada. What the treaties mean was that the settlers were allowed to move into Indigenous lands. And so I'm going to say that one more time just to try to make it clear. The treaties does not mean that we gave land away to the British or to Canada. It just allowed settlers to live into Indigenous territories. And so when you look at the map, most of you will see the map of Canada. You won't see the map of Indigenous people and their territories. And what I'm saying is that when you do look at the map, what we should be looking at is the map of Indigenous people and their territories. That's the real map. More land has been stolen by maps than by guns and bombs. So what you do is you take a map, you make a map, you take the Indigenous people off the map, And you keep teaching that over and over and over again. You start attaching nationhood and flags and all sorts of things to the map, and you start calling it Canada, and you start educating people that that's what it is, and you create provinces and boundaries and jurisdictions and all sorts of things, and you teach that to kids for 120 years. People actually generationally they begin to believe it, or they know that's to be true because that's what they're taught in school. And that's also based on the doctrine of discovery, and that's also based on white supremacy, because our Indigenous people were here and we're still here, and our lands were stolen, and our territories are not defined, and it doesn't show that those are Indigenous lands. It shows that it's Canadian lands, and that's not correct. We don't have a treaty with Canada. How did Canada get our lands? And the treaties that we did have just allowed the British free passage into our lands. It didn't mean we gave the British our lands. Why would we ever do that? We shared our lands. We said, yes, you can live here too. Doesn't mean that they have to take the whole thing, which they did. So Canada inherited all of that. Canada inherited all of the theft. And of course, to keep the theft under control from renegade Indians and from uprisings, they had to create something called the Indian Act. And the Indian Act is a piece of legislation that controlled the Indigenous populations by forcing them out of the territories, off the land, onto the reservations, where they can then be controlled and filtered through colonization so that they'd no longer be a threat to resource extraction. Because Canada had and still has one of the largest mandates of resource extraction on the planet. And of course, there's only one demographic of people that are really getting in the way of that, and that's Indigenous people. And so their plan to have Indigenous people colonized and melted into Canadian society was very important for resource extraction, because it meant that Indigenous people wouldn't go back to the land, have their tribal beliefs, have their spiritual beliefs, and it would reduce the risk of Indigenous interference. So let's go through some of the Indian Act stuff that's kind of crazy today. It's the only race-based legislation that still exists in Canada. And I also heard that it's the only race-based legislation that exists in the world. For the sole purpose of subjugating Indigenous people. So that's white supremacy stuff. Women were denied status. It denied the rights of First Nations to vote. It prohibited the sale of alcohol to First Nations. If you live on reserve, you can't own your own land. It imposed a foreign colonial system based on the Robert's Rules of Order, and then that's the Bound Council system. It restricted First Nations from leaving the reserve without permission. It forbade First Nations to speak their languages and do their ceremonies and form political organizations. It prohibited. We weren't allowed into a lot of the services that were in the towns and cities, and so the Indian Act was really a white supremacist act. But we have to remember that the white supremacy was just used as a tool to, of course, oppress the Indigenous people. So that's why the white supremacy existed, is because it was important, because that's how you oppress the people, is through white supremacy. So when you look at this status card, this is an Indian Act status card. So all Native people have one of these, or most of them. And on the very top left-hand side, you're going to see a Canadian flag. So right away, our nationhood gets dissolved, and we're called Canadian. and we're called Canada's Indigenous people. We're not Canada's Indigenous people. I'm Anishinaabeg. I'm not Canadian. I was born in Anishinaabeg. That's who I am. I can't help who I am. It's just like me going over there and saying, okay, you're now Anishinaabeg. You'd look at me and you'd say, no, I'm not. Don't tell me who I am. Like, that's really strange. Don't freak out on me, dude. Same thing. Don't say I'm a Canadian because I'm not. Because I already know who I am. So on the other side, you have Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. So what's fascinating about that is that Northern Affairs is mining, logging, fossil fuel extraction, and Indians are Indians. And so you have two departments that are lumped together because in order to to control the resources and get them to market, you have to control the Indians. And so they've always put these two departments together because they go hand in hand. You have to colonize and oppress the Indigenous people so that resources get to market. And this is happening all over the world. Um, of course, you have a name, you have a number, you have this is also based on blood quantum, which is like what Hitler was doing and stuff. It's actually amazing because Hitler and South Africa actually took this system that was so successful and started to use it in their countries. And so here is actually a Jewish status card that was developed from the Indian Act. And again, it was all based on blood quantum. It was based on controlling a demographic of people, in this case, the Jews. And it was a system that worked. And they also did it to the black people in South Africa and said they too got a card. They too had a thing based on blood quantum. They too had a number. But there's only one left in existence. The Jewish one doesn't exist anymore. The black one in South Africa, the tribal card, doesn't exist anymore. The only one that still exists today is the Canadian Indian Act status card. That's the only one that exists. Built solely on white supremacy and the ideation to control and eradicate First Nations people. And it's still in existence. And so our people were left with Indian reservations. And the reserves are 0.2% of the total land mass. And Canada is 99.8%. But we also have to remember that even the 0.2% is not native land. So we don't have underlying land title to those lands. Those lands, that 0.2%, is, they call it land held in trust by the Crown for the use of Indians, is what they actually call it. And so it's really, we don't even have underlying title of the reserves. And so underlying title doesn't even exist in the Canadian legal framework. So Indigenous people literally cannot have their own land in Canada. It's impossible. It's legally impossible. There's no legal mechanisms in place that could validate underlying land title. And so the lands were completely 100% stolen. And Canada still guards and protects that land theft. And of course, they used a genocide to make sure it could happen. And so I want to talk a little bit about how the land is set up now. We have, of course, different. The land has been separated into different categories. So in this particular map, you have the light green, the beautiful light green. I love that color. I want to eat it. That's Crown land. I mean, it's all crown land, but I mean, it's crown land that's not being used or it's undisturbed. It hasn't been bought and it hasn't been designated for anything. Then you have a darker green, which are parks. Parks are usually preserving some sort of a natural resource. So when you look at the different parks in the States and different parks around the world, they're actually finding that they were made parks because they're actual resource reserves for later on in history. You have the pink, which is private land, so federally private land. And so what that means is that uh, those pieces of land were bought bought by Canadian people, but it's still Canada's land. But it was just paid for by regular people. The yellow stuff, you'll see little specks of it. Those are the actual Indian reservations. And then you have the white M&R administrative districts, and they use those districts for um, land management exercises, fire tower stuff, all that sort of stuff. And then you have another white one with planning areas. So planning areas again are just research areas, different things like that. But here's the striking thing about this is that Indigenous people, none of this is actually ours. None of it. Like not even a speck. When the settlers came here, the only land they ever had was the dirt beneath their fingernails. How'd they end up with all this? And the Indigenous people end up with nothing. That's called stealing, and stealing is bad. Stealing bad. But that doesn't mean that you stole it. It means that the people long ago stole it. But it does mean that most of Canada benefits from stolen Indigenous land. So most people do benefit somehow from the oppression of Indigenous people because you have to oppress the Indigenous people to uphold the land theft. And so Canada benefits greatly from these issues, which is why there isn't a huge outcry for justice. Um, Mining. So when you look at the different uh, resource extraction activities, so mining, logging, pipelines, fossil fuel extraction, they always happen around where Indigenous people live. And it's funny that, so for example, just in Ontario, we have, they say there could be possibly up to 85 communities without clean drinking water just in Ontario of Indigenous people. How can 85 communities, Indigenous communities in Ontario, not have clean drinking water? It's crazy. I mean, if there was a non-native community that didn't have clean drinking water, then they would be on it. It would be fixed. Like out of those 80 communities that don't have clean drinking water, all of them are Indigenous communities. There's not any non-native communities that don't have their clean drinking water issues resolved quickly. And so some of these advisories, drinking water advisories, have been going on for 25 years. Here's a recent one at Niskanataga. And I'm going to read you what some of them are saying. In this house, there are 13 of us with no clean drinking water. 13 people live in a house with no clean drinking water. A ghost town, abandoned and neglected by Canada. Dear Mr. Trudeau, come live here for 2 weeks, then you will know what our people face. Canada continues to violate our rights to clean drinking water. You're now entering a 25 years BWA zone. This is the community of Niskanataga, Lansdowne House, is going through right now. No end in sight. Water is freezing up, so lake water to flush toilets is going to be either a dangerous activity or a non-avenue soon. I have posted many responses over the years to why the government is giving $2 billion for sustainable housing when our First Nation communities still don't have drinkable water. A necessity of life, and our focus should be placed here and not on other countries. I remember our PM running on a platform of clean water for Indigenous people. The photo shoot at Shoal Lake where he was carrying 2 jugs of water. Please let's pressure the government to make this right. If they won't, then let's get someone who will. Especially when they ran on this platform, but have extreme gifts for other countries when our own people suffer. So the government knows about the issue and have addressed it, but are ignoring it because nothing is being done. And this is true. Do you know that Canada gives billions of dollars to oil and gas? Billions. That type of money would fix all of these water problems. But they don't. They give it to these guys. And this is a diamond mine where literally billions of dollars are taken out, and the communities that live close to these places are suffering severe poverty. And it's also poisoning the water. So this diamond company failed to fully report levels of toxic mercury at Northern Ontario mine. And so a lot of these Indigenous communities are suffering from the pollution of resource extraction, and yet the government still won't give them clean water. And people are getting poisoned, and people are dying. And so First Nations community grappling with suicide crisis, we're crying out for help. And so First Nations have the highest suicide rate in the world. In the world. And it's all based to land dispossession, resource extraction, loss of culture, loss of language, poverty, oppression, the genocide that took happen, the effects of residential school and generational trauma. And so suicide is really rampant in our communities. I can't even tell you how many people I've known that have committed suicide that I had to bury with my own hands. It's really, really disturbing. And what's happening to Indigenous people is toxic. It's disgusting. It's genocide. It's the foundation of it is built on resource extraction, and white supremacy is used often to keep these mechanisms in place. Racism is built right into the very gears of how Canada is run. It's built right into the gears of the country. That doesn't mean that Canadians are white supremacists. I mean, some of them are, but I mean, most are not. But the systems that run the country definitely are racist towards Indigenous people. There is no question. For example, you look at Attawapiskat, and the highest rates of suicide that have taken place is unbelievable. But people are actually starting to try to make a difference. People are trying to step up and try to change the narrative a little bit. We want to. Our people have been oppressed for so long that we're starting to get heroes, that are emerging from the oppression and the genocide. And they're starting to do really good things. So Shannon Kitchigan, an Indigenous education advocate, is named one of the 150 greatest Canadians. Again, the media calls her Canadian, but she's actually really a Cree. Next slide. Grassy Narrows. You'll see This community here has been without clean drinking water forever. Their waters were poisoned, and so many people were left with neurological disorders from the mercury that was in their water, and so many of them are crippled. You can't see it, but all the elders on the bottom, they're all in wheelchairs. That's why they're not standing up. Grassy Narrows First Nation has lived with one of the consequences of the worst disaster in Canadian history. Their people died en masse because of mercury poisoning. Indigenous people have been slowly poisoned by a leak at the Dryden chemical plant that has caused debilitating conditions and early death for community members. Again, the people have been suffering, and it's not right. There's something wrong when this happens, but because they're native, it's okay. You have places like this, the tar sands, the oil sands, where this is causing pollution on a catastrophic scale all over the world. And so this is a horrific event. This is a catastrophic global event that's taking place. You can see the tar sands from the moon. And not only that, but they plan to extract like billions and trillions of barrels of oil. And they call this dirty oil because of the mess that it leaves. It's horrible. It's really horrible. But again, the people are oppressed because of this. A lot of people will say, well, you get everything for free. You're a lazy, drunken Indian. You get you can't look after your kids. You're a drunk. All of these things. So a lot of racism is perpetuated. And it seems like there could be movements for everything else, but the movements that Indigenous people have are never ever sustained, or they're never ever. A lot of people don't know about them because we're kind of like the bottom of the barrel. And so racism against Indigenous people is rampant in Canada. But here's some facts. Money received by First Nations are not tax dollars. It's payment from land and resources, treaty and annuities, interest payments from a federally controlled trust fund. And so the money does not come from taxpayers like people think. And I don't get nothing for free. I don't get absolutely nothing from the reserve. Nothing. Zero. And I've gotten zero my entire life. And so it's not like people are getting free anything. That's not the case. Everything's been taken away from them. Canada, on the other hand, has gotten free everything. Canada has gotten free everything. They're the ones that get everything for free, without a question. Because they sure didn't give us anything for the land. Okay, so you'll see in this photo here, there's a lot of Indigenous people that are rising up, and they're trying to make a difference to protect the lands and waters. So in the first left-hand slide, we see a photo of, this is us in San Francisco. We're at the head office at Wells and Fargo, which is a bank that heavily invests into the pipeline, the tar sands. And so we went down to San Francisco, and we painted on the road. And we remember seeing this is actually called East Wall Street, because all of the world banks and all of the major banks in America are right there. All those are world banks on the sides that you're seeing. And I remember seeing all the executives looking down at us as we were painting that. It was actually pretty cool. And we actually got the police to buy into it too. So they weren't stopping us. because one of those police officers believed in climate change and said, no, we're going to let this go through. We need to change. The one on the bottom left is a picture of that happened in Winnipeg, where the Indigenous people got together to stop a pipeline that was going to go through. They were able to stop it. On the right of that is the same picture. It was the same rally. It was to stop Energy East. And then on the top right is a picture of Standing Rock, of course, where the Indigenous people gathered together and they tried to stop the DAPL pipeline. They were unsuccessful in that. Under the Obama administration, Obama, for whatever reason, he failed the Indigenous people during that time, and it was a horrible. Old ladies were getting pepper sprayed in the face. These sick dogs, trained dogs to attack the Indigenous people. They poisoned them. They gassed them. They shot water cannon at them when it was 20 below out. They really it was a horrible the violence against the Indigenous people in the name of resource extraction is often quite severe. This doesn't happen to regular Canadians. This only happens to Indigenous people. Yeah, so this is people standing up for what they believe in. This is people standing up and saying, no, we have to save the environment because we are in abrupt climate change. The world is going through an ecological collapse, and we need to figure this out. We need to work together and try to figure this out. And here's the thing. This is a global crisis that we're in that's going to take a global human response to fix. In these pictures, you see just Indigenous people fighting like giving it their all. But we need everybody to give it their all. This is how we win. This is how we save the planet. And I believe that we're going to. And so I don't know how much time we have left. If we want to jump into questions, Jody?
Yeah, sure. We have some time left. So if anybody wants to put your questions into the chat box, I will moderate those with Isaac. And in the meantime, while you're thinking about questions or what you might want to ask after listening to this really amazing presentation, I'm just going to share another resource and I'll put the link in the chat box as well, that you can access to learn more. And maybe I'll get Isaac to you can also talk to it a little bit. So yeah. A lot of questions that come up, when is around, okay, what can I do? How can I get involved? How do I make a difference? So the first thing we always suggest is get educated, get informed. It takes time to learn about all of this, as you can probably appreciate listening to just the little bit that was shared today. So take the time to dig in and learn. There's so much material that's available now to help support your learning. So this resource, understandingindigenousrights.weebly.com, is just one of many, many, many that exist. It has, places to go to find out more information. Pam Palmater is an excellent place to go to. She's got this podcast. Arthur Manuel's books, I'm not sure if they're on here or not, but we highly recommend those as really good sources of information. In here, this one was put out recently. Why are Indigenous peoples blocking the railways? Because I'm not sure if you remember, it kind of got picked up in the news back in May, June, what was happening out west. Well, what has been happening for a while and continues to happen out west with the Wet'suwet'en people, there was some solidarity movements and actions taking place over here in Ontario. So again, a lot of this is to try and dispel the myths and the stereotypes and all the inaccurate information that's out there that paints Indigenous peoples as these like evil protesters. And I just want to even mention the term protester is also problematic. It's not about protesting. It's about protecting, defending lands, waters. And again, as Isaac was saying, this is something everybody needs to get involved in. So this is just some information. Again, Instagram has some really great places to go to as well. You know, for this one here, how to show up for Indigenous land defenders. So just things that you can also do yourself to get informed and get involved. So if you go along here, there's little tabs, again, to bring information into, here's about Wet'suwet'en. Maybe you've heard of tiny house warriors. Again, what's just to kind of give you information as to what's been going on. Feel free to jump in anytime, Isaac, if you wanted to share anything.
Okay, yeah. So of course, take the time to you know, kind of just glance through all that stuff. You know, start to look into it. But more importantly, find out where you fit in and how you can make a difference where you live. Because sometimes it's not about you know, helping somebody else. It's like sometimes it's taking the initiative and trying to help, you know, where you are right now. And so that's really important too, is that we want people to take the initiative to start protecting the lands and waters where they live. That's really important. And of course, to work in solidarity with Indigenous people is important too. We definitely need that. And so I think that the more and more that we work together, the better the world is going to be. There's no question. And you know, it's the thing is that when young people get together, something incredible happens. You cannot stop young people when they band together to do something. And when there's enough ideas, nobody can stop you. And nobody's going to want to stop you because you're changing the world and that's what everybody wants. So start mobilizing yourself. Start um, you know, holding meetings and think tanks and start being strategic in how you're going to do things because um, we need you. And the adults aren't going to do it because it's always the young people. The young people are free and they don't have bills to pay and they don't have all the responsibility. The adults are deadlocked in the system, but not you young people. You're not. So this is your chance. This is your chance to shine. And we want something that's positive. We want something that's nonviolent. Indigenous people are not violent. There is a clear understanding all over North America that we are nonviolent. We know that we cannot defeat this thing with a bow and arrow, but that we have to be for something as opposed to against something. And that if we want the world to be a more beautiful, better place, then we have to create beautiful. So what we need is a revolution of the heart, a revolution of the beautiful, a revolution of something that's great and positive. And it's something that only you can do. Old people like me can't do it. My days are over. I'm done. It's your turn. So I really encourage you to get out there and do something amazing. But always think, be safe. Be kind, be gentle. And you know, when you're for a river, it's different than being against a pipeline. Or if you're for a specific forest, it's more powerful than being against a lumber company because it creates a different energy. When you're for a forest, anybody can participate. Grandmas, kids, aunties, babies, moms, dads, you name it. Everybody can participate when you're for something. But when you're against something, it creates a different energy and it creates conflict and it also creates friction. So be strategic in what you're doing, but make no mistake, do it. Get out there. I don't think we have much time left for questions, but we definitely want to take some questions.
We do have time and we have questions. So here's the questions are rolling in. We have here. So the question is around, well, I think it's a question that'll lead to a discussion around the policing in Canada. So the question is, do you think that Trudeau would ever resort to the violence that involves water cannons to put down a protest? So I guess this, I think, came up during when you're talking about Standing Rock. So perhaps you want to talk a little bit about the RCMP.
Yes, the RCMP was actually created to contain the Indian problem. That's what gave birth to the RCMP. That's why they were actually formed. And the police have more Indigenous people are killed by the police than any other race in Canada and in the United States for that matter. So more Indigenous people are killed by police. And Indigenous people are always met with police violence when it comes to protecting their lands. It seems to be a normal thing. It doesn't happen to non-Native people, but as soon as Natives are there, it happens. And so have they used water cannons on Indigenous people? No, they have not. But they have used chemicals. They've used, of course, force. They've broken bones. I remember one time they arrested this woman that was singing with a drum, and they smashed her face in the ground. They grabbed another woman and they busted her arm, and they snapped her arm in half. And they were sitting there singing with a drum. And so the violence that the police have against Indigenous people is very high. And a lot of the police captains are saying that there's racism involved and that there's racism in the police forces, and they're trying to extinguish it, and they're trying to look at these issues very carefully. But definitely racism, resource extraction, police, it's all linked together. It's all part of the design of how to keep the resources getting to market. Good question.
Yes. Another question here is in regards to status cards. So do they still exist? And do you think there's a chance that we might get rid of them?
They still exist. I mean, some people do get rid of them. A lot of people don't, because once you get rid of your status card, so I'll tell you what I did. I cut my status card in half, and I also got disenrolled from the Indian Act, meaning that I got taken off the list on purpose. But what happened after that? I wasn't allowed to get a house on the reserve. So my basic human rights were stripped from me on the reserve in my own community. I couldn't vote. I couldn't be a part of any decision-making platforms. I couldn't vote. Couldn't have a mailbox. I couldn't go to school. There's all these different things that I couldn't do. So it was like all of my basic human rights were stripped from me once I cut up my status card. So a lot of people don't out of fear. And so I lived in shacks and tents and teepees and things like that for a lot of my life because I could never get a house on the reserve because the government wouldn't allow me. One time I was staying at my sister's house, and the Indian Affairs told me I wasn't allowed and that the RCMP were going to be called and I was going to be removed. Can you imagine that? Like if one of you were staying at your sister's house and the police were called and told that you couldn't live there, even though your sister said you could live there? That's how oppressive it is on the reserves. Good question.
Yeah. So I'm just going through here as well. I think this may have answered it. There was another question that came up similar. What is the main purpose that Indian status cards serve today? Did you want to add to anything else you've said about that?
Um, they're used to get an 8% tax break in Ontario. They can also use them to cross the border, and that's the biggest things why, and that's why that's the biggest thing why people have them. And so
There's a,
people,
go ahead.
yeah, so people don't. A lot of people, and it's fear based. They say, well, if you get rid of it, then there's going to be nothing. And so there's a lot of fear that's put into it, and so that's fear, a lot of fear-based politics behind it. But that's a good question too.
Okay, so there is a question that came up around lead quantum, and I want to recognize just for a moment there, one of our council representatives is also on the chat today, helping answer some of your questions. So thank you, Nancy, for being here in the chat. And but for those of you who can't access the chat, I'm going to also ask Isaac as well. Yeah, so do you want to just talk a little bit about blood quantum? I know
Well, I
that's
think,
US, more in the US.
yeah. So as Anishinaabe people, we define who we are as Anishinaabe. So our communities define who we are, and that's not up to the government to define who we are as a people. What our quantum is, what our language is, what our nationhood is. It's not up to the government at all. It's almost like us going up, like it'd be like us going to say China and basically saying you're Chinese because of blood quantum. That would be wrong. We don't have the right to go to another nation and dictate who they are based on blood quantum. That's something that we do, and that's something that we govern amongst ourselves. And that has no that has nothing to do with Canada. That's our nationhood issues that we deal with. And so Canada needs to keep its nose out of it.
So I think it's an important point to really highlight, is that this always is about Canada trying to maintain a control and oppressive measures. And this is just another tactic in terms of dictating who's who and determining, yeah, all of that, which is, and I think this is like, it's such a, for those who are just learning about this for the first time, it's quite a wild realization that this is taking place in Canada, because I know a lot of people are quite shocked to hear, Canada has such this, is seen internationally anyway as like being this country of, great democracy and freedoms and opportunities and diversity, and yet has this amazing ability to hide that it's got apartheid legislation. It has, highest suicide rates, all of these pieces that you've talked about today. And this is why we're doing these sessions, is to try and get these truths out and to change the narrative that's been in education. And this is why treaty education is so important, because it opens the door for these conversations to happen around that. So I'm going to just jump back to the chat box here to look at some other questions that have come in. There was a question around reconciliation. Sorry, I just have to scroll back up and find it. I've lost track because it's scrolled down now. Okay, here it is from a class with students. If the Canadian government was given 1 year to fix things, what would it take?
I don't think that the Canadian government can fix things in 1 year. But there's always this ideation that Canada has to fix Indigenous people. That's not the case. I'm doing okay. Canada needs to fix itself. So Canada needs to fix itself. So Canada needs to ask itself that question. Don't come here trying to fix me. I'm okay. The last time they tried to fix me, it was horrible. I was taken away at 5 years of age from my parents, from my mom, by Indian agents because they wanted to fix me, because they felt that if I was living with non-native people, that I would somehow be better. And that was a horrible experience. I'm actually in therapy over it today. So don't try to fix me. Canada needs to fix itself. And if it had 1 year, I would tell it to start working on respect and dignity for everybody and equity. Absolutely. And the environment, like, you know, the Canadian government needs to really think about these things. If they had 1 year, that's what I'd tell them to work on. Fix yourself.
So one last question here, and then we'll do some closing words. Your video seems to be frozen, but we can still hear you, so that's good.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on reconciliation?
Reconciliation, in my opinion, cannot happen until land is returned. How can it? It's almost like if somebody steals your house and your truck and steals all your money from your account, and then they don't give it back, but then they say, well, let's reconcile, but you're not getting your car or your house or your money back. How can you reconcile with somebody like that? You can't. So if Canada's expecting us to reconcile without any land back, that's an unrealistic expectation. So land, we need some of our land. We're not saying we want all the land, because we agreed that we can both live here together, but us having no land has to stop. True reconciliation is land back and respect. That's a good question.
That's a great answer. And it also, it just echoes what Nancy's been putting in the chat box as well. And I think, hopefully people will start, as you're, connecting with, and this is something we really encourage you to do, is find out who is, where, depending on where you live, make relationships with your local communities, with the Indigenous peoples that are local to wherever you are. Build relationships, work together, co-create beautiful new things, working in partnership with each other together. We have lots of examples, that we have another session that we're going to be doing in December that's going to be highlighting some of that work through the Ontario Teachers Federation webinars. So there's lots of really great stuff that can be done that is transformational, that involves everyone. And, Isaac and I and Nancy as well have been working together for a long time, and we've, created some really cool initiatives through education. So Isaac, is there any last words that you want to share with us today?
Well, I do want to share this, that right now we really need to band together for the environment. And that, a lot of the racism, a lot of the genocide and the oppression against Indigenous people was so that resources could get to market. And we know this. And since resources have been going to market, it's causing an ecological collapse. And so this is going to take all of us to band together. We have to get to the source of what the real issue is. And of course, it's the Canadian government wanting to get resources to market. And so we have to band together in unity in many different ways. In the spectrum of change, there's many different ways you can do it. But let's keep supporting each other. Let's keep finding the good in each other, and let's start saving the world. We need to save the world, and it's going to take all of us to do that. And it's going to take people working together, and we can do it. Easy peasy. It's just a matter of getting people to work together. That's the hard part. So put your differences aside, because adults They always find a reason not to work with each other. Is they all get grumpy and political and they all get stubborn. But kids, you guys can change the world. And you need and right now we need this. We'll support you. So get out there and start a movement. And you know what? I mean, it's going to happen anyway. It's going to happen in your lifetime. You will see a revolution for the environment like you've never seen before, and it might as well just start right now. So just start doing it. Start making art, start singing songs, start talking, start making videos, start networking, start creating stuff. You know, if the problems of the world are hate and greed and just miserable people, then the antidote is love and being caring and sharing and being happy and trying to work together, making beautiful. If we want to leave something, if we want a better world, a beautiful world, then we have to make it. There's no other way. So with that, um, and it could be fun. This all can be really fun. And so get out there and have fun and change things. And it starts with you and your friends. You don't know how those things can grow. And I really believe that. So with that, I want to thank you for taking the time. I want to thank you, Jody, and teachers and kids. Um, be positive and really support each other and always have respect as the foundation of what you do and how you move forward. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us today. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Isaac, for your time with us today. It's
Thank you.
always so powerful listening to you, and you're so inspirational. You're definitely a superstar for a lot of people. Like I mentioned, inspirational and really trying to move us into action. So I want to thank everyone for attending today and bringing your students and your classes into this conversation. Our recording can be found on our website, fnmieao.com, under the events and webinars tab there. You will find also previous webinars that have taken place in live streams. And we will be continuing to offer these important informational sessions for you across the province in a variety of topics to continue the learning and to inspire you to move into action. So again, thank you for spending the morning with us. Take care, and we will see you at the next one.
Bye, everybody. See you later.